there I was just coasting along, minding my own business. And then Russ contacts me and says, let's do a podcast. So here we are.
Well, welcome to the show, Randall.
Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah, it's been a long time, man. Let's see. We last had you on our show, episode 108. I think is that
the
right?
atomic weight of silver.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, episode 108. And then the whole time we were doing Cosmographia, you never came on our show again.
But we did 108 shows.
We did 108
Cosmographia.
shows of Cosmographia.
Yep.
And now here you are, back on our show.
Here I am.
Yeah.
And here you are laying a guilt trip on me. I just showed up, barely seen you guys in months. You're already laying a guilt trip on me.
Well, it's my specialty.
Well, I stand as accused, and I vow to try to do better.
Well,
listen,
we've been talking about getting you back on the show for, for months we've talked about it, and it just hasn't come together until now. So I'm just saying, I'm really glad we finally worked it out, got a date. You came on the show, and it just coincides with the return to the moon. And we were talking about discussing the moon anyway. So it's like, it seems like perfect timing. It was meant to be, Randall. There's no guilt here.
Well,
All the times you completely refused to come on the podcast was because you knew that we were waiting for the perfect time to come back on the show, which is now.
Well, 108 is a lunar number, right?
That's right.
Silver is traditionally the metal associated with the moon.
Yep.
In many cultures. And is it a coincidence that the atomic weight of silver being 108 and the radius of the moon in miles being 1,080, of course, there's no meaning or coincidence or significance to that. It is merely a coincidence that these numbers happen to be associated with certain phenomena. Also, the fact that the lunar diameter is 1/108th of its distance to the Earth, right? You knew that, right?
I didn't.
108 times the lunar diameter is the mean distance from the Earth to the moon.
Wow. Nope, I didn't know that one.
Well, it's a fact. I mean, within a very small you got a little wiggle in there, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But it's wiggling around 108, pretty much is what it's working out to be. Because, elliptical orbit means that sometimes there's a perihelion and sometimes there's an aphelion, and those can be somewhat different. So you've got the variation in the distance from the Earth to the moon. I should say perigee and apogee, because it's the moon relative to the Earth, and the Earth relative to the sun is perihelion and aphelion. and in both the orbit of the moon and the orbit of the Earth, they are elliptical, as you guys well know. So there is going to be a little bit of variation, right? That's what I'm talking about, the wiggle room. But the wiggle room is pretty much vibrating around that 108 frequency, if you want to call it that way. So by the same concept of things, the solar diameter at 864,000 miles times 108 is right at a little in excess of 93 million. The distance from the sun to the Earth. So you've got that 108 ratio, solar diameter to solar solar distance to solar diameter, 108. Lunar distance to lunar diameter, 108. So
it does seem like a resonance, like you were talking about. Like there's some kind of, what would you call it?
Well, that's 1/4. If you were thinking in terms of cycles per second, so 4 times that would be vibrating at 432, right? Which is the note A, right, Kyle? But it's mostly 440.
440.
Right. But in some traditions, it was 432, right?
432, yeah.
So
What were we talking about?
He's still doing studio work. Sorry.
This is, you got to know this, right? I just realized like I need to get the watchers chat up here, and I started doing that, and then that is of course when you
He can
asked me a
tell you're not
question.
paying attention, so he asked you a question.
So what was it?
what we were talking about was ratios.
Yes.
And then ratios equaling, when you have multiple ratios and they equal each other, what do you have? You got a proportion. And proportion is the key to pretty much all of creation, right?
Yeah.
Everything is a proportional, and is in the proportions of things that determines everything else. Why you have elements becoming substances, or substances becoming entities, living entities, whatever, right? So it's in the ratios. So you got 108 times the lunar diameter is the lunar distance. You've got 108 times the solar diameter is the solar distance from the Earth. In both cases, the Earth is the common variable between the sun to Earth and Earth to moon.
Mm-hmm.
But it's 108. And 108, and I'm not sure what the significance of this would be. I pondered it, have not come to any conclusions yet, but the angular relation of two edges of a pentagon is 108 degrees.
Yes.
So, when you multiply 108, you can get 216 and 432 and 864, and there's the solar number, if you want to call it that, 864,000 miles. And then you can get 1,296, you can get 25,920 out of these numbers. So now we have this astronomical application that goes even beyond just the distance, size, diameter ratios, if you guys are following what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to what extent has that knowledge been known to ancient peoples? I think a lot more extensively than mainstream scholarship has given them credit for. I think we're learning that the idea that there have been advanced societies in the past is now, it's inescapable. There's so much evidence at this point that can only be explained by making your working assumption be that there were advanced civilizations in the past that have left very little record, but enough record that if you're looking at it from the right perspective, it becomes pretty much glaringly obvious that, yeah, there's a whole lot more going on in human history. It's a whole lot deeper and a whole lot more complex than anybody was imagining a generation or two ago in scholarship. Now suddenly we realize that, Graham Hancock's been right all along, that there's more to it. But we're just barely, I think, at this point, beginning to get the dim outlines of what that might have been and what form it might have been. And one reason we've overlooked it is because we're pretty much looking for ancient civilizations. We're looking in a mirror and imagining that if there's nothing, if we don't see our own reflection, something that looks like what we've already created and what we call civilization, if it doesn't look like that, then it's not civilization. And there couldn't be any advanced knowledge that we would consider to be basically scientific knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of at a point now where we have to accept the fact that it's looking more and more likely that there is such a dimension to our historical past. And that is also associated with the whole concept of repeated cycles of catastrophe. Because now what we've got is a correlation of models. We were willing to accept, science was willing to accept that the continuum of life wasn't a smooth curve, but it was essentially a sawtooth. And that was the description of the biological evolution of life on Earth, was a smooth curve until 25 or 30 years ago. And that smooth curve had to be stretched out to start including huge bumps and drops within the curve. So you had rapid speciations and you had mass extinctions. So the mass extinctions are pretty much explained. Asteroid impacts, comet impacts to a lesser extent, and large-scale volcanism. And probably in the big mass extinctions, we had a convergence of volcanism from within and asteroid impacts and so on from without. And through that combination, oftentimes we see some of the big five that are considered the really big five extinctions in the history of life are associated with both evidence for major impact and major volcanism. So you have from within and you have from without, and those really together have left their imprint on the curve of biological life. So what we now see is that there's a hiatus after the mass extinction events of a given amount of time, and then there's an inflection point, it appears, where something switches, and all of a sudden species start rapidly multiplying. And this has been seen 25, 30, 40 years ago, clearly, and called rapid speciation. What is driving rapid speciation is still an open question, but it usually comes after a period, after a hiatus, after a span of time following the mass extinction events. Okay, but so this whole curve that applies to the rise and fall of life on Earth is pretty much exactly mimicked by the curve that describes the rise and fall of civilization within the time span of humans on the Earth. So we have the same sawtooth curve. And if we go back several spikes on that sawtooth curve, we're into realms that have actually are separated from us by perhaps 3 or 4 great years of Earth convulsions. Because look, the last, 36,000 years ago, we've had at least 2 ice ages that have come and gone in their entirety. People have no concept of what that means. And when we realize that the transitions into and out of those alternate global ecosystems, if you will, a glacial and an interglacial, that period of change is really where most of that period of transference, if you will, from one state to another state, from what appears to be a stable state to a completely different stable state, takes place in an extremely short period of time. Much shorter, like a couple of thousand years, not 50 or 100,000 years, but a couple of thousand years. And within that couple of thousand years, there are periods where it's even down to almost single-digit years in which things change essentially ecologically in the global ecosystem overnight. Now, how did ancient civilizations cope with those natural factors within the Earth planetary system? Well, they must have come up with ways of coping. And to some extent, and as long as they were able to successfully apply those ways of coping, they were able to endure. But whatever preceded, let's say, the Younger Dryas, has been mostly erased by the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a reshaping of the Earth's surface, the Earth's geomorphology, that was probably as extreme as any that's taken place within the last 5 million years. Some of the geomorphic changes and the changes in the biome, the redistribution of all of the elements, particularly the polar elements, particularly that. But think about that. 5 million years, we have to go back before we can be certain. Here is a global change event that equals or exceeds the Younger Dryas. Now, within that Hemp-Hill, it's called the Hemp-Hillian event, and the Younger Dryas, there's a bunch of spikes. And a lot of those actually are close to being the severity of the Hemp-Hillian and the Younger Dryas. Now, what's driving those? What's driving those spikes? Because those changes that are occurring between glacial and interglacial and back again, literally, in some cases, are occurring within a few years. So I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but I think it probably involves the sun, and I think it involves probably both impacts from things outside and a terrestrial response from inside. And just as with the mass extinctions in the curve of life, mass extinctions in the curve of human civilization, I think this is going to be the model that replaces the current, still prevailing, still dominant model of prehistory that has dominated since at least the early 20th century, really earlier than that. It goes back to Lyellian geology and Darwinian biology. Evolution and gradualism in geology, evolution in biology, Darwinian evolution, they're like handmaidens. They were introduced almost at the same point in history. They completely, perfectly complemented each other, even though it's only half the story, essentially. It's the story of the periods, the phases between the concentrated transitions that are described adequately by Darwinism and geological uniformitarianism. But neither one of those doctrines explains what occurs within those spikes. You know, when the curve just peaks and then comes back down and tails off and then remains relatively uniform for, well, we know now, what do we have to go back to the Eemian, stage 5E, and we find from 116,000 to 130, 129, 130,000 years ago was the Eemian. And the Eemian stage 5E, it's called, and that was always considered to have been the analog for the current Holocene glacial. Although it was not an analog. It was warmer than now, far less ice, glacial ice than now, sea levels up to 20 feet higher during the Eemian, and within the Eemian, the 13,000-year Eemian, which is interesting because that still fits the curve. It still fits that, you know, the 26,000-year curve, 52,000, et cetera. So you have that in there, and I kind of lost my train of thought, but
Well, I was about to ask you if the Holocene has broken this cycle, but you're saying that there
okay. Right. So actually the Holocene has been more stable than the Eemian, because within the Eemian, there's a couple of big spikes, like major shifts, not shifts that would, transition the planet from a full glacial to an interglacial, which is extreme, which is extraordinary when you really begin to start really contemplating the scale of the changes that took place over a few thousand years between the late glacial maximum, where you've swallowed up 6-7 million square miles of the Earth's surface, completely frozen and locked under ice that is not now, right? So you got to get rid of all of that ice. How do you get rid of it? Well, you got to come up with some energy. It takes energy to melt the ice. So was it the energy of the sun? What was it that it was able to melt that ice in a series of great sweeping pulses, 3 or 4, or maybe even 5 pulses over a period of 4,000 to 5,000 years? We don't know. But we know that at least one of those pulses was associated with the fingerprints of a cosmic impact of some kind. One of those is pretty much for certain. But there's at least two more that are very prominent. One of them is at 14,600 years ago, and the other one is at 11,600. And the one that's interesting about the meltwater spike at 11,600 is a couple of things. One is because it's precisely the end of the Younger Dryas, when there was a major spike of climate change right there at 11,600. And that is now, look it up, I'm sure you guys have, the inception point of the Holocene is now actually dated pretty precisely at 11,600 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Well, is it a coincidence that Plato pinpointed that period of time, 2,300 years ago in Timaeus, when he reported that the subsidence of Atlantis occurred 9,000 years prior to Solon's journey to Egypt? Because he hears it from the Egyptians, and they tell him 9,000 years ago, this is what happened. There was a great war between the people, the civilization that was inside the Straits of Hercules, and the one that was outside. And the one that was outside aggressed, came in and began to wage war upon and enslave the people that were living inside. And then these, I'll call them proto-Athenians, were able to organize everyone. They rose up. There was a great war. The Atlanteans were driven out of the Mediterranean, and without giving a specific time frame, but apparently the implication being that it was immediately after, there was a great earthquake that causes Atlantis to subside, and it was associated with, and most people miss this detail, a severe erosional event on the Greek peninsula that he describes along with the events that caused the subsidence of Atlantis. So what you've got there, though, is the significance of it is that 9,000 years before Solon's journey to Egypt is 11,600 years ago. So you have precisely coinciding with Plato's date for the subsidence of Atlantis, you have meltwater pulse 1b. That's the date that's now given for there being a great meltwater pulse into the global oceans because of an accelerated melting of the volume of ice that still existed at 11,000. And there was a pretty substantial amount, but it was certainly less than half. By 11,600, the ice mass had shrunk to less than half, I think, of what it was at the late glacial maximum. And that shrinkage took place in that very same process. There were periods, longer periods, where there was just what you would almost think of as normal melting, seasonal melting, but then they were interrupted by fast pulses of melting, like boom, big waves of almost tsunami wave scale meltwater pulses are spewing off the ice sheet. And this trip that we're planning up to Western New York is an example of that. Just like how Moses Coulee and probably Grand Coulee, both, what you have to picture is that the genesis of those was extremely high pressure meltwater, subglacial, coming from the north, actually coming from above the boundary with Canada, coming from up within Canada, up by Lake Okanagan. In fact, all the way up to Prince George. That's where I think that the meltwater was really coming from. And you had meltwater pulses coming off the ice sheet, and we can document them now gushing into the Pacific. The whole city of Vancouver is built on the fan delta of the catastrophic flows that came down the Fraser River Valley and discharged into the Pacific, just like the city of New Orleans is built upon the fan delta of the outwash into the Gulf that was brought down, carried down by the mega floods coming down the Mississippi River Valley. Same thing. So New Orleans is built on a fan delta built during the Great Deluge, if you want. So is Vancouver. So anyways, the point is that you have to picture, like the Finger Lakes. If you look at the map of the Finger Lakes, you can see that they're radial. They converge on the Ontario Basin, which is the deepest basin in Lake Ontario. And it's in the eastern part of the lake. And at the bottom of it is extremely deeply scoured. There are just remnant scabland type features across the bottom of that basin. I can pull up some slides here in a second if you want. You can see what it looks like. But the Finger Lakes themselves radiate from the center of that basin, right? Now, the Finger Lakes themselves were south of the ice margin. But the drumlin swarm that is between the north ends of the Finger Lakes and the south coast of Lake Ontario is filled with hundreds, thousands of drumlins. One of the most magnificent drumlin fields on planet Earth is right up there in that region. And so that was under the ice because drumlins form by subglacial sheet floods flowing high velocity under tremendous pressure. So there's an enormous amount of shear energy dispensed onto the terrain of subglacial till. Right, so you think of a two-part process. The glaciers come in, they grind over the landscape and pulverize everything up into just a chaotic heap of boulders and gravel and sand and fine-grained stuff, organic stuff, tree limbs, trees, even the remains of plants and animals, but it's mostly geological stuff that's ground up by the glaciers. So creates this pulverized ground mass. Now, second part of the process is you have an introduction of enormous volumes of meltwater into the subglacial environment. And there's enough meltwater coming from the surface, what we call the supraglacial meltwaters, are ponding up catastrophically on the surface of the ice, creating an enormous amount of pressure to this water column that's reaching the base of the ice sheet, forcing it out. Now, it's moving under tremendous pressure. So because it does that, it's trying to reduce, just like in a boat hull. What's a boat hull designed to do? It's designed to minimize the drag, the shear drag of the hull moving through the water. Well, the water, when eroding something, naturally wants to erode it into that optimum form aerodynamically or fluviodynamically. So any any difference within this this ground mass of till is going to lead to differentiation of the flow of the subglacial waters. What it does, though, is it takes those obstructions and differences within the subglacial topography and creates these elegant fluviodynamic forms that look like inverted canoes, and there's thousands of them. And the central radiant of the axes of these drumlins aligns on the same deep basin in Lake Ontario as the Finger Lakes do themselves. Now, you go to the south end of the Finger Lakes and you see the consequences of extreme turbulent meltwater rushing up the Allegheny slopes to the south, then having to reverse and flow back to the north. But although some of the water manages to overtop the watershed divide, you go to the other side and you find these places like Blue Rocks, the Singing Boulder Field. What's the other one? We've been to a couple of them up there. And basically, they're just huge masses of boulders that were being carried into fluidized. You know, if you think about pure water.
Wait, are you talking about Ringing Rocks Park? All those boulders?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Because I had read they're sort of deposited on the hillside rather than down the valley.
Well, they're both.
So are you suggesting that that hole basically in Lake Ontario is like a mega Yokel and the subglacial waters are bursting out and pushing everything uphill? Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Yes, that's what I'm saying. And the lakes themselves are how deep? I mean, who's you got any guy in the background who's fact checking?
The deepest part of Lake Ontario, Watcher?
Yeah, we got the Watcher with us. He'll look it up for us.
Is the Watcher?
He is the Watcher. The Watcher is here.
Okay, so we want to know, how deep is Lake Seneca and Lake Cayuga of the Finger Lakes?
Okay, Seneca and Cayuga.
Finger Lakes. How
Pull it
deep?
up, Watcher.
But see, here's the problem, the geological problem we get into. There's two depths, because there's the bedrock depth, but the bedrock crevice incision is like half filled with sediment. So is the depth of the lake now going to be the depth to the top of the sediment pile, which is probably like half the depth of the lake if you remove the sediment pile?
Yeah. He says Seneca is 618 and it's deep. Is that feet, Watcher, or meters? What is that?
Give us that in freedom units.
Yeah, freedom units, bro.
We don't do meters on this show.
Okay, so 618 feet and Cayuga is 435.
Okay, so that is not, okay, so that's the depth to the sediment. That's the infill. That's the top of the infill right there.
Yeah.
Now you got to remove that infill to get the true depth of those crevices.
Yeah. So you might guess 1,200 feet for Seneca and 800-ish for Cayuga, something like that.
Yes. Well, yes. And I would have to, I didn't come prepared for that discussion, but
Well, that's okay.
Really?
Oh, I thought you were we're talking about the moon, though, right?
Yeah. This is all.
Yeah. Okay. So just okay. Now here's the thing.
This is all
you
about.
Guys, I have enough respect for you guys to think now. Okay, these guys are going to be able to follow the entire arc.
Yes, I'm following
this storyline, and have the faith. Have just a small amount of faith that at some point we will come back to where we started.
We know.
Yeah.
This is what I'm saying. You don't have to have all of the data on this because we're actually talking about the moon,
right? Yeah. And we know this.
We know.
So we're not worried about it.
Yeah. Okay. So where was?
Well, that's amazing. This is an outburst. I was just blown away thinking about that because the Finger Lakes are radiating out.
Yeah,
and it's just like an explode because you got the super great glacial lakes or whatever pushing down. There's like a column, and then it bursts out of the
scours these lakes
because it's got terminal moraine at the end of it too, which is going to be like a dam.
Yeah,
and so then it has to just bust through that. And man, it's just
well. Here's almost what you have to picture. Like you've got the five main lakes. Interestingly, that you could pull up any map right now, and I could do it and share the screen, and you'd see what I'm talking about. And I probably should do it because I want you guys to see some of the LiDAR stuff.
Sure.
And maybe we take a minute here coming up, and I will pull that stuff up, and we can look at, because it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing what we're now seeing. And have you seen what Darren is doing?
Yeah, I was going to mention that, the disaster map.
Disaster map. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. And I got to get with it, because, I could see the potential there of being able to depict stuff. But as I'm looking at it, of course, he has it completely wrong, but that's okay.
Of course.
But that's okay. No, that's okay. Because there's two parts. See, there's two parts. There's the technical and artistic ability to create those landscapes, right? So, yeah, I mean, that's what he's really pulled together and learned how to do. Now what you need to do is
do it right.
Yeah, do it right. Yeah, Darren, do it right, dude.
So one of the things that would make it really difficult, because nobody really knows the answer to this, is the isostatic change.
Well, we have a pretty good idea. I think we can have a pretty good idea.
Yeah, so you can lower the levels, right?
That's a really good point to bring up, Kyle.
Yeah,
Kyle. Well, we can measure isostatic changes up along Hudson Bay, but is that going to be representative? No, it's not, because the movements, the vertical movements of the Earth's crust are not going to be uniform at all.
Not uniform
around the geoid.
Yeah,
they're going to be, certain areas are going to be more susceptible to upward or downward movement.
Yeah,
but just like anything else, it would be a model, right? I mean, we have to make models, and then, but you could have, like nowadays with AI, you can have an algorithm that just kind of, okay, here's the weight and mass, and it's going to displace.
Here are the edges of the plate. But, this part will displace.
It can be done, but it will, and it can keep getting better. But I was impressed with Darren's work.
Oh, totally. I'm just. So I'm very impressed with what he's done.
But you got to give him shit too. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, you got to give him shit.
Right,
I mean, it's Darren, right?
It's great, bro. Too bad it's wrong. I love it.
I mean, now it could be anybody else, and we might let him slide. But
yeah.
In Darren's case, no, we need to give him shit. Well, look. No, he's got a super good start. I mean, where he's going with it is going to be awesome. All he needs is just a little input. Well, from me. Yeah. And then and only then will it be awesome.
Right there.
That's great.
Okay, so I almost should show you guys something, because I do want to open some stuff up here and talk about this study on the age of the pyramid.
Sure.
We do need to pull that up. Let's see. I think I've got it right here. I hope I do. Ah, yes, here we go. Well, we should look at this report right here. Can you?
Yeah. Preliminary report on the absolute dating of the Khufu pyramid using the relative erosion method.
How about that?
Yeah.
Well, what he comes up with, and it's interesting. It's not. I mean, his logic seems to be pretty firm. We'll pull up and look at some of that, and you can see what you think about it. But
I'm interested in that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So
while you're pulling that up, I will. I'll open this beer.
Okay.
Well, I was going to mention too, so we went from the moon to the cycles, the climate cycles, and then we're talking about the most recent destruction and the end of the Younger Dryas and everything. But going back to the ancient civilizations, and obviously this connects to Egypt, it seems like if these people had a civilization in the distant past, in the deep human past, that they must have survived some of the rough periods during the Pleistocene. But then the Younger Dryas was just too energetic, right? It basically wiped them out to the point to where there were only a few remnants afterwards. Does that seem right to you?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So there's
usually how it goes.
If that clarifies. if we want to, narrow it down, I'll just yes and no.
That's how you answer every question I ask you, Randall. Well, yes, but also no. Yeah.
I say yes and no, because this brings us to really one of the more outrageous scenarios that's being implied by the evidence of both the question you just raised. I mean, that's a fundamental question. If there was advanced civilization, whatever form it took, whatever technologies it may have incorporated, and I think we have to at least broaden our perspective on these things to acknowledge the probability that there could be advanced technologies that are not based on fossil fuel.
Yeah.
I think we can almost accept that as a given. And I think once that's accepted as a given, we can also make certain assumptions about what are the probable forms that an alternative civilization, what alternative forms of energy could an alternative civilization run on, right? And I think there we get into that. It looks to me more and more increasingly like it would have to be something plasma based. I think that's something that seems to be the most logical conclusion from unless there's some completely unknown source of energy that we've completely, but when we start talking about plasma, now we're getting into this really sort of liminal realm between what we think of as reality, substantial reality, and something that's really considered to be more in an etheric, if not even a spiritual level of things, where we get into the psychic phenomena, we get into the the visions of people through the ages that have had experiences of things, whether it's UFOs, intimate type of encounters, or the Marinette visitations that have Lourdes, for example, or Fatima.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's this realm that seems to be almost poised between our dimension, our framework, which is primarily sensory based, right? Most of when you're experiencing, it's going to be through the five senses, but obviously there's got to be other senses. We know that just from looking at other forms of life, that there are a whole range, a spectrum of senses far beyond what we normally have access to, right? And somewhere out in that changing, that transitioning reality, we get into a realm that I think ultimately would have been what was the substrate of all spiritual phenomena, spiritual movements, in anything, whether it's psychic stuff, whether it's out of the body experiences or prophetic or any of that, is kind of moving into that realm, into this alternate realm of a higher reality of some kind. Now, is it possible that a civilization technologically advanced enough could know how to transition itself into an alternate state of existence as one possibility? And I think the key to a lot of that might lie in the stories and the inheritance, the legacy of the past, the stuff that we have inherited from many generations ago that has deep roots, and we assume even roots deep enough that we're into the realm of prehistory, and we can draw on that and reconnect with some of the fundamental, the archetypal patterns where I think this story has been preserved in our human subconscious. It's almost as if the human subconscious has been programmed with these certain images, certain forms, figures, certain symbols, patterns, whatever you want to call it. And we're all carrying this stuff and connecting with it in varying degrees of being able to perceive it, right? Some people are obviously more psychic than others. Some are not at all. Some, Russ, did you ever have, let me ask you this, did you ever have deja vu when you were younger?
I have had deja vu many times. Some of it very strong that lasts for 15 or 20 seconds, sometimes it's real short, like just a few seconds, but there's been times where it's extremely powerful and it keeps going.
Yeah.
It is very disconcerting.
Didn't we talk about this before? Sorry. But I kind of see. He's just like, ugh. I kind of see where you go. So wait a second. Let's back up. If I just want to get this straight, because I think what you're suggesting is if these people, they had a technology or a technological understanding of like different other realms or enabled themselves to change realms, then this is why you're saying then yes and no. Because yes is like, yeah, they're no longer, they perhaps escaped this realm in a sense. And maybe this is the result is like all of these weird phenomena of beings that seem to be somewhat like us, know a whole lot about us, but are very transient.
And also like they care a lot about the planet, even though, you know, people think they're aliens, but they actually seem to be from here. I see the same. Yeah.
Well, see that what you just said, that's an interesting twist on it too. You said, well, they seem to be from here.
Right. Yeah.
Well, now here's the other thing. Now, I would say that you're faced with a planetary catastrophe. And how would we scientifically be in a position to, let's say, predict a planetary catastrophe? We couldn't necessarily predict a gigantic volcanic eruption or series of closely spaced volcanic eruptions 50 years from now or 100 years from now.
Right. Or a solar outburst or whatever.
Or a solar outburst. We don't have but the discovery of an asteroid that's on a repeatable orbit, yes, we could say, yeah, we are going to be occupying the same point in space on this date, unless something intervenes and changes the trajectory, which, you know, maybe could happen, but it could also work the other way. But so let's do a thought exercise, and let's suppose that we were faced with the discovery of a major asteroid, half a kilometer to a kilometer in diameter, let's say, in that size range, enough that it would create a planetary catastrophe, could wipe out a area of the surface of the Earth roughly equal to, say, the North American continent. But, and of course, anything within that region is going to be utterly annihilated, right? But people will survive, things would survive. It would be hellacious for a decade or two in the aftermath. Yeah, it would take a lot of adaptation to survive, but people would survive. Now, a 6-mile diameter, let's say, asteroid, no, we would not survive. It's not if we were still at least on the surface of the Earth. Now, if we were faced with the discovery of an asteroid, let's just say it's a half a mile in diameter, and it's likely it's going to impact the Earth. And okay, we're going to have to make observations here, and we'll be able to refine these observations over time, and eventually we're going to be able to tell, is it going to hit the Earth? Yes. Oh, okay, it's going to hit the Earth. What part of the Earth is it going to hit? Where is ground zero? Well, you know, that can be calculated, right, to a pretty high degree of accuracy, right? And then so what do? Well, what are your choices? Somehow you've got to prevent the impact, or you're going to have to move a whole lot of people out of the way. Either way, you know, it's going to be a major challenge. But let's say you really want to have diversify that the human civilization, because even a half kilometer impact is going to pretty much destroy the global economy. The question then becomes, how long would it take that global economy to recover? And you could probably assume at least a few decades, at least. Well, the thing is that you're now in the aftermath of an event like that. You're also going to have probably a 10 to 20 year period of climate instability, which is going to add to the challenges of surviving and keeping any kind of a social structure intact in the aftermath of a global catastrophe, right? So how do you optimize the probabilities that you could preserve intact the best of let's say the cream of civilization, where you include its science, you know, its knowledge, its art, you know, its literature, its music? Where would you would want to create some kind of an arc, if you will, where the greatest diversity of life and culture, science, knowledge, learning, all that could be preserved. Would that not be then at this point a primary directive for the human species if we knew there was a very high degree of chance that there was going to be a global catastrophe in 30 years?
Yeah.
And we either got to get the technology together to know how to redirect a half mile or asteroid moving at, 20 miles per second, or we have to move a lot of people out of the way, or what are our other options? Well, the Ark, I think, the Bible and all kinds of other stories, whether it's the Greeks or the Sumerians or even the Mayans, it doesn't matter. The idea of people surviving gigantic floods is a universal tradition because we now know from paleohydrology that gigantic world-destroying floods did occur. They occurred all over the world. Not one big flood drowning everything simultaneous, like the simple minds imagine, but a series of great floods over a period of 3,000 or 4,000 years that rapidly raised sea level, that caused extreme torrential downpour rain, that caused direct melting off of the ice sheets, that caused, did I say tsunamis? Tsunamis, this is another thing we should talk about this. There's a lot of the coastlines of the world are showing evidence now of gigantic tsunamis making landfall. 200, 300, 400. The one on Madagascar left deposits 600 feet or more above sea level. So, we're literally talking in some cases about tsunami waves 600 feet high making landfall. So the point is, just like Plato says, there's multiple causes for the catastrophes. But fire and water are the two primary agencies of the great catastrophes. But now back to the train of thought. If I was in charge and I was faced with that, I would say, okay, so we need to create an arc where in the event of a cosmic catastrophe, we can reestablish civilization in its highest and best manifestations. What would I do? What would I suggest that we do? I'd say, well, we got right next door at about 252,000 miles away, we've got a satellite. And that satellite might be an optimum place, as a matter of fact, to establish a refuge. And in fact, the more you look at it, the more it almost appears as if it was set up for that purpose. So we discover that we got these gigantic caves that are presumably gigantic lava tubes.
Yeah.
But that seems very consistent with the stories themselves that literally describe, the Chinese. They have stories about voyages to the moon and that the structure of the moon is honeycombed. That's directly out of Chinese mythology.
Wow.
Yeah, I could actually pull up and show you some of the stories, but they're not the only ones. See, here's the thing, and this is the idea I think we're going to. Is it possible that there have been one or more breakaway civilizations?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is almost certainly yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I like the idea that, using the plasma as an energy source or something that might have been used, we may not even recognize the signs in the archaeology that this was
Right.
being used because we don't use it, or it's not a very common and very well known or understood thing on a large scale, like a civilizational scale as an energy source. How would we know the proxies to, if we were digging and looking for, because right now we know about mining, we know about smelting, we know about fossil fuels, and we can
Yeah.
kind of tell like, okay, well, this type of stuff started appearing in the ice cores once we started smelting metals in this way, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't see that, or in some cases, we don't see these proxies very prevalent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so,
So people were like, well, then there's no advanced civilization.
there were no
back then.
advanced civilizations.
But if they weren't fossil fuel based, it would be different proxies.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. That's a good point.
Well, I think a fundamental point, really, because how do we recognize the proxies? What form do they take? I mean, that's why I kind of always liken it when you're you're on the track of these mysteries, and you're trying to solve the mysteries. Think of it as, how any detective work, you've got a culprit, and you've got a victim. In this case, we could say the victims are, half the megafaunal species of Earth that suddenly went extinct during the Younger Dryas. Well, that could be the corpus delicti right there. What happened to them? Did they all become extinct at once? Hey, before I go on, are you guys hearing an echo?
Nope.
No. You got an echo
I'm hearing an echo.
of
That might
yourself?
be our problem here. Let's see.
Let's see.
Yeah, just turn this.
I could switch over to headphones, probably.
How about now?
No,
Try it now.
test 1 2, test 1 2. Yeah, no, I'm not hearing it now.
Okay.
Test, test. Okay, that's better.
Yeah, it might have been
What?
coming your voice coming through our speakers and back through the microphone. Sorry.
Okay, that's what it is. Okay, so that's my point, is that if there were uh, other civilizations built upon forms of energy utilization that were different from ours, how would we recognize? What
Yeah.
would we look for? And that to me is what Kyle just raised. That question is a fundamental question.
Yeah, and that is a good point too, because especially in the old world, and in some cases in the new world, like when people are doing prospecting for mining, they often find ancient mines for minerals and metals and things like that. But
Uh-huh.
that doesn't seem to be the case for petroleum. Like, I think that we would have seen signs if some ancient peoples were mining for petroleum, right? If they had been, you'd find some kind of sign of an ancient well or something like that. So maybe, yeah,
One would, yeah, I mean, yes, I would
yeah,
agree with that. There
yeah,
must be places that you would find some remnants of.
right. So
Well, then that gets us to, the things like, the finding that looks like there's going to be more of, like Gobekli Tepe,
yeah,
which now, okay, there's somebody was building something back there. Pretty much, am I right that the dates on that are pretty darn close to the younger end of the Younger Dryas?
yeah,
But
Yeah.
then those are probably, am I right then that could be interpreted as being the youngest, and that there could be
Yes.
parts of it that are older? Am I right there?
They're now calling Gobekli Tepe the end of the Taj Tepe civilization. They call it the Taj Tepe civilization now.
because so many sites have been found.
Yeah.
So Gobekli Tepe is like the end.
The end.
But
Okay,
you're
yeah,
also
that
correct in that the dates that they have found are the they basically are the limit. It must have been built at this time or before,
Yes.
basically, is what they're saying. So yes, those dates must be the last possible time period in which it could have been
the
constructed.
terminus antiquum.
uh-huh.
Mm.
Okay. Well, so then some of the others could be thousands of years older.
Yeah.
They are. Yeah, I think Kortik Tepe is one of the oldest ones, and it's like 14,000 years old or something like that. It's
14,000. Okay, is there I mean, I don't know anything about that one. What is it called?
Kortik, Kortic, I think.
And
Tepe.
has some of it or has been excavated?
They've been excavating there. I haven't seen a whole lot of photos from it other than there's like a massive collection of vases and vessels, hard stone
Uh-huh.
ware. I don't know what you call it. What do you call it? Stone
Yeah, stone
vessels.
vessels. Yeah.
Okay.
But I haven't seen photos of like giant megalithic T-pillars or anything like that from there. But again, I mean, every one of the sites they excavate the bedrock out. They're cutting limestone bedrock. So
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I don't
Wow.
know a whole lot about it other than the vases coming out of there, or vessels, whatever you want to call them. But they're making like basalt, tons of basalt jars, vessels, vases.
So, I mean, is there any thought or projections as to how many equivalencies there might be to Gobekli Tepe there? I mean, are we talking dozens, maybe?
Yeah, dozens.
Dozens?
I mean, I've heard up to like 40, but
40. Wow.
We've been told 40 when we're there, but haven't seen 40 in the literature, right? That's more like
Right.
dozens. Yeah.
yeah, more like a dozen. But again, it's like the literature, this is from the locals and
Yeah, the
stuff.
locals are saying, oh, they found 40 to 60
Yeah.
of these sites.
Wow. So, what is that implying about the population, the level
Yeah.
of social organization?
Right.
And we're looking at potentially, in round numbers, 12,000 years ago, say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I recently found out is that a Taj Tepe site was uncovered in the 70s in the Sinai Peninsula. The same people, pre-pottery Neolithic A and B, was right under Mount Sinai, right near the St. Mary's Cathedral, or not cathedral,
St. Catherine.
St. Catherine's,
St. Catherine's, yeah.
St. Catherine's Monastery.
That's right. The monastery of St. Catherine. Yeah.
So they at least went, they were all through the Fertile Crescent and all the way down into the Sinai Peninsula. It's really interesting. I don't know. I've been digging into that for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So-
Well, have you guys you've heard of the Vajra?
Yes.
What was the Vajra?
That is a good question. I have no, it's like, it's treated as a kind of weapon, at least in the
Shamir.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And Indra used it to destroy the.
It was the instrument of power wielded by Indra.
Yeah.
It was the fundamental power, the cosmic power that was wielded by Indra in the form of the Vajra. And I think that could be an important clue right there. For example, and others spread. There's probably once upon a time a lot more indications about what forms these technologies could have taken,
Yeah.
which have been largely lost, if not suppressed. But there's enough. And I think one repository of some of this information is probably the Vedas, because there's a fair amount of description in there of things that seem technological.
Right.
And the Vajra is the one that, sort of got handed, interestingly, from Vedic India through Persia right over to Greece and Rome. From Greece to Rome, you can follow the movement of the Vajra symbol, wielded first by Indra, then by Mitra, then by Zeus, and then by Mithras. And I think there must be a connection, an etymological connection between Mitra and Mithras, I'm thinking. But Mitra was the supreme god of cosmic power in the Zoroastrian and Persian traditions. And you could trace the Vajra. Each one of those gods wielded the Vajra. And I think the Vajra, if we take it apart, I've kind of done that using some of Malcolm's plasma technology, as well as some of the others, including Victor Schauberger's, which was based on vortices, right? Fluid vortices, right? And I think that what he was doing with vortices was probably an important inroad into an alternate technology, especially when we realize that there are certain forces that seem to want to cause plasmas to spontaneously organize into certain particular forms. And those, what's her name? Sheila has done that work. Have you seen her work where she takes these, I better not try to explain it. She was on my show showing, amazing stuff where she shows the visual, the wave, the sine wave curves of various frequencies. And what she's been able to show is that you get coherent sine wave curves that form elegant geometries when you hit those, say, basically this cosmological numbers, the 108, the 216, the 432, the 864, etc. And yeah, she's got a whole demonstration of that she's done. And it's pretty impressive, actually. But so would suggest to me frequency. In other words, and in another form, I'm thinking vortices. You've got frequency and you've got vortices, and there seems to be a connection there. And under certain frequencies, plasmas form vortices. So I think that could be a very, and I don't know enough about it to be able to have any too much beyond that, which is speculative, but I think there's enough to suggest that it's in that direction. And when you look at,
I just saw a diagram, like a motion diagram video about the electron positions on an atom, like states or whatever.
Yeah.
Like it'll, there's this idea that the electron is orbiting the atom, the nucleus of the atom, and then you excite it or you add energy and it'll jump to a next
higher
state,
orbit. Yeah.
higher orbit. Well, this diagram showed this, and it was actually a vortex. So it was a sphere, and you have this point along the axis, and there's like a vortex that goes around and then down on the southern side, and it's spinning.
yes.
And they were talking about up spins, down spins, whatever.
Yep.
And it's just a matter of like in other words, this vortex can move around.
Yeah.
And be up spin or down spin or whatever. And it's like the diagram has like a bright light along the vortex on this sphere that is like what we detect as the electron position. It was really interesting. But of course, in quantum field theory, all of this stuff is like resonance, like what they describe as pockets of resonance in a field. There are no particles in the field theory. The particle is just like our way of describing something, or
a pocket of resonance.
The way we observe it. But yeah, it's like how do you get a pocket of resonance? What is that?
Yeah.
What form? What geometric form would a pocket of resonance take? It's either going to be like a vortex or a toroid, or it has to be self-contained.
Well, what you just said, Kyle, a toroid, if you think of a sphere and you collapse that sphere along your axis, the cross-section of that is a toroid.
Exactly.
Right, a torus. And if you were to draw a spiral around that indentation, where if you're pulling the North Pole and down, the South Pole up, and they meet on the equator, you've now created a torus, right? Created a torus. And you could think of the equatorial plane as being the 0 point, and you've got a vortex at the top and you got a vortex at the bottom. And if somehow these vortexes or vortices were conducting energy, that energy, and there's empirical evidence that suggests this is what happens, there is an energy that accelerates as it moves down to the 0 point. And when you get opposing vortices that meet at that 0 point, I think that's what's happening. If we can set up a plasma stream, and that's where, let's see if I have probably got an image here that we could look at that shows the cross section of a torus. Here we go. Okay, so can I share a screen?
Absolutely.
Okay, Riverside, I do share right there. And I'm going to share a screen, and I'll go to a window, and we'll do this. It's a little bit blurry, but this is the cross section of a torus, right? And let's see if I can do this. Okay. So the outer here, these form a torus, and you can see this indentation here. And the idea is that a plasma stream forms a vortice in this torus. Let's see. There we go. Something like this. A collapsed sphere.
Yeah. But the idea, the reason we're talking about this, the idea is that an ancient basically lost civilization may have had a completely different technological line than we have had. So we wouldn't recognize the signatures of their technology, except in the case of architecture But then in their architecture, some things are seem to be represented. Like, for example, if we go back to the pyramids, all of these resonances with certain numbers that are cosmological and have to do with distances to the moon and all this other kind of stuff. Like, in other words, those numbers may be represented in their architecture because they were also useful to their technology because they were using some kind of resonating plasma something.
Yes.
I don't even know what to call it, but all the questions we have about, like, well, why does the Great Pyramid reflect all of these cosmological numbers? Well, maybe it did because it was necessary to their tech if the building itself had some kind of technological function.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's see. I'm going to share a screen again here. Oh, screen. Window.
Yep.
There it is right there, the Vajra.
Yeah. Closed in that one.
Yes. And over here, let me see that one. The
Yeah, I can
Vajra.
see it on the upper right hand.
Yep. Yep. So the Kandariya Mahadev Temple, the power of 8, Indra wielding the Vajra. And then let's see here.
Oh yeah.
That's damn close to a thunderstorm generator.
Well, that's an expanded toroid there. It's
It
the
is.
poles are not touching in that sense.
Variations on it.
There's an open one, right? So that in the legends, they or in the text or whatever, they describe it as like it was almost always closed because when it was open, it became a deadly weapon.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was usually held closed. Oh wow, I hadn't seen that one. A cruciform.
Let's see, 36.
So yeah, the idea that if you have like this contained plasma energy in this sort of toroid, and this is represented by the Vajra, if you could somehow open that up and then it releases all of this contained energy at once.
Well, look at this Greek
Everyone
coin.
yeah, everybody.
So here's the open Vajra, exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's opened. Yeah.
It's opened. Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
That specific story where Indra uses it, what does he do? He destroys the ice dragons that are holding back the waters and causing the drought or something like that.
mm-hmm.
He opens the Vajra and uses it to strike them a killing blow. Yeah. And releases the rivers.
Now look at Zeus's version of the Vajra.
Oh yeah. It's got a
vortex.
got a nice vortex there.
Mm-hmm.
So, hey, Watcher's saying that the Kortic Tepe is roughly 12,000 to 12,500. When were those dates? Because when I was looking at it, they were saying it was 14,000. They're always revising dates.
Yeah, they are revising it. It's new work.
And he says 11 major sites around Gobekli Tepe.
So Zeus's thunderbolt is represented as the Vajra sometimes. That's the idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
And here is Mithraic Kronos, also called Aeon or Zervan. Lion head, and then see the serpent up here?
Hmm.
And the serpent winds around, making a helix. Then comes down here and touches the earth at this symbol right here. And you see the serpent's head up at the top of the lion's head?
Yeah.
And here's the thunderbolt or the Vajra on his chest.
Ah.
And then here he holds the key and a scepter. This tongs and a hammer, a pine cone, a cock, like a rooster, and a caduceus. Looks to me like that's actually like a coherent symbolical statement. If you understand the inner meaning of each one of these symbols and then you can synthesize them into a whole, I think it will disclose a fully coherent message.
Well, what is the message?
Well, that's Well, I mean, that's the question there.
Yeah.
I was hoping you guys would be able to help me on this one. Geez, you just want to be handed on a silver platter. Oh, silver. Oh, that's right,
Yes.
silver.
Yeah, I
108.
want it
That's
to be
right.
handed on a platter made of silver, Randall. Give it to me on the moon.
Okay, maybe this will give us some more clues. So, okay, so Mithras, check this out. This is Mithras, and this is the sun. This is taken from this is a drawing. They do these rubbings off of these uh, um, inscriptions that are carved into the rock. I forgot where this one is, but I've got the reference. Oh yeah, found in this region of Italy. So it's the sun god kneeling before Mithras. And
Huh.
how do you know this is Mithras? Because Mithras always wears a very distinct cap
Yeah.
with that little knot at the top that rolls over towards the front, usually. Sometimes towards the back, but usually it's towards the front. And what's he doing? Well, he's handing the Vajra off to the sun. This is what he's got in his hand, the Vajra. And the sun holds a sword or a dagger. Mithras presents sun with a thunderbolt or Vajra. Then this one, a Greek relief sculpture showing the Vajra. Let's see. You see right there, Vajra?
Mm-hmm.
That's how you tell it. It's the vortex. It's like the tornado. Here's another one down here. Here's another one over here. And there was 4 of them in this. And this is a sculpture representing Phaeton here, entreating his father, the sun god here, to allow him to drive the chariot. So this is an image of the myth that would be unfolding in the act just prior to the earth being set on fire by Phaeton. And what's interesting is the presence of the 4 Vajras. And down here, let's see if you can see it. Okay, right here, you can barely make it out, but there it is. There's the urn. And this would be Poseidon turning over the urn and spilling out the waters of the flood. And let's see, there's others that are more clear, but you can begin to see that what I'm getting at here is that maybe the fingerprints that we're looking for are right under our noses if we begin to understand that it's all encoded or hidden into the stories, into the myths, into these narratives that have come down to us, even from 4 to 5,000 years ago, and probably longer, both in the form of myth. And there, myth can take many forms, and one of the most potent forms of transmitting myth, I think, is what Dan or Dave, Starman,
Matheson.
Dave Matheson, Dave Matheson. His stories and his work really sets another dimension to the whole idea that there is this collection of these, if you want to call them patterns, that are encoded with information. And if you have the key to decoding it, what an ingenious matrix upon which to, what a convenient or ingenious scroll upon which to, uh, to draw to write your narrative is on the stars, because they're not going to change much at all from one generation to the next generation, even over the millennia. So what Dave Matheson has found is that there was a universal projection of meaning onto the cosmos, onto the celestial dome. And he's shown, to my satisfaction, that it was, with some variation, it was a clearly a universal tradition. And that fits with, the other universal traditions. If we take like Plato says, the destruction of the earth all by fire and by water, that's universal. Well, we now have scientific explanations for how you can destroy a world. We don't mean destroy a planet, like blow it up like Krypton and send baby Superman to Earth to survive. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about what destroys a world in the sense of everything that as part of your not only your social reality, but your interaction, your interface with the natural world. You know, if you survive, let's say, on top of Steptoe Butte in the Missoula flood, and that flood comes through and the entire landscape, because you guys have been up there, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So you survive on top of Steptoe Butte, and after the floodwaters have finally drained off, you look around and what's left of your world?
It's
Nothing.
it's mud. Yeah.
Mud, as far as the eye can see in every direction. And if somebody is 20 or 30 or 50 miles on another mountaintop or somewhere where they've survived, how are you gonna even know that they're there?
Right.
It may take several generations or more before isolated groups of survivors can begin to interconnect with one another.
Yeah.
But if you
Pick your
have
pick your mic up.
juxtaposed on that a group of survivors who didn't survive because they happened to be in the right place at the right time. They survived because it was part of a long-term strategic planning
Yeah.
that they had undertaken. And I think we can derive that without too much extrapolation from the mids themselves. There was an elite group always that had foreknowledge. They took certain steps to prepare for that, and as a result, they were able to survive these events and pass on the human species and as much ecological diversity as they possibly could. And I think that's why so many of the stories do have this idea. You know, the Noahide flood, there's two stories interwoven there. In one case, he's told to bring on a pair of every breeding species. In the other one, it's 7 of every one. And that's just one example, but there's actually 2 stories of the deluge interwoven into the Genesis account. And if you work through it verse by verse, it becomes very clear. You can separate the 2 and realize that whoever the authors of those chapters of Genesis, they integrated those 2 accounts of the story of the deluge. But then you have the Deucalion and Pyrrha account in the Greek tradition. Then you have Manu, and you guys know all that. But there's a reason. You know, at this point, we know that because these scale of events were real. It wasn't just an exaggerated memory of some local event, which is how they get around it. That's their way of getting around the flood myths. Or
Yeah.
that you had it was dispensed by Christian missionaries.
Randall,
Those are these
real quick, pick your mic up. It's
these indigenous people. The indigenous peoples knew of the flood stories because it was dispensed by Christian missionaries, and
yeah.
that they didn't have any prior traditions of such stories. But of course, that's completely bogus. They did,
Yeah.
and George Catlin, the Indian artist who spent years with dozens of different tribes, reported that the one similarity that they all had was these beliefs in a cataclysmic past and the survival of a great flood, and in some cases also a fire. And in some cases, there was 2, even 3 cataclysms clustered together, fire and flood happening at some of the South American traditions get into that very much, fire and flood.
Yeah.
Most of the North American traditions are flood, but there are some fires traditions interwoven in there.
And
but they didn't get that from the missionaries. This is in part of their indigenous traditions that have been handed down.
Yeah. Yeah. And in some of the Native American traditions of the flood, not all of them, but a few of them also have the forewarning.
Have the forewarning. Right, exactly. Like
visiting.
coyote.
Yeah, a coyote or an eagle,
Or an eagle, yes.
comes to the seer, the wise man, and tells him there's going to be a flood. And a lot of the stories are just like a few people survive by getting in a canoe or riding a log or climbing a mountain. But in a few of them, they get forewarned by something, which is also
right.
One of the hallmarks of these global deluge stories is that there's somebody tells them, tries to tell.
We're trying to solve, in my mind, it's like we're forensic detectives. We're looking at geology, we're looking at ancient history, we're looking at mythology, we're looking at modern science, and we're trying to piece together these clues and basically figure out what the hell happened.
Yeah.
And by knowing, it's like that famous quote by Einstein. In a way, it kind of applies to this. It's like, what's he say? If I had an hour to figure out a problem, You said I'd focus for 55 minutes on the problem, and then the last 5 minutes would be the solution. He said it was something to that effect,
Yeah.
and I before I ever heard that quote, I always kind of thought that myself, I mean, because by going over and over and over these things from these different perspectives, trying to learn about planetary geology, trying to learn about, asteroid phenomenon, comet phenomenon, the life cycle of comets, and looking at how the rise and fall of civilizations and the rise and fall of life on Earth, and how the traditions of old might complement or, even enhance the modern scientific traditions. And I'm 100% convinced that they will, and they do, once we can get over this prejudice, this sort of I guess you could say, modern chauvinism about our own society and its level of advancement compared to societies that have preceded us. And now, because of our understanding of catastrophism, we can understand why. See, and I'm not too hard on a lot of the archaeologists that go, well, where are the potsherds? Well, that's not what we're looking for, dude.
Yeah.
That's not what we're looking for here. And the thing of it is, if you go back to the potsherds of 20,000 years ago, you probably wouldn't recognize them because they would have probably become lithified into stone, and you wouldn't differentiate just from a typical conglomerate that you would see exposed in a road cut sometime.
What's really funny about that argument, the where are the potsherds, is that Gobekli Tepe is supposed to have been built by the pre-pottery Neolithic. And it's like, yeah, bro, there's no potsherds there. Actually, none.
None.
Well,
But I was going to say one other thing that you made me think of with this, the idea of imprinting or using the stars as your scroll for these myths, for this universal knowledge base. In a way, that's an arc.
An arc.
I mean? If you had to preserve the books of your civilization, what better way to do it than to make sure everybody understood, okay, we're going to tell the whole story using this scroll because it can't be destroyed by any comet or any disaster on Earth.
Right.
So it is an arc.
It could only be destroyed if the universe itself was destroyed.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're assuming that has a low degree of probability.
The story could be destroyed.
Yeah.
If every last human was destroyed who knew about it.
But you could have a cataclysmic event that resulted in 100 years of cloud cover. And then you would have an entire generation who wouldn't be able to see the canvas.
Yeah.
Several generations, and then you might lose a lot of the ability to tell the story using the sky.
Yeah.
Even if it was 20 years of cloud cover.
Yeah, even if it was 20, like one generation, basically.
Yeah.
It would get lost.
Yep.
Unless there was a specific effort on the part of somebody or some group to not let that happen.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that is probably what we would think of as we look at, the ancient, quote unquote, religious traditions or ceremonial traditions or whatever.
Priesthood.
The priesthood, exactly. That's the priesthood. They're the keepers of the tradition. And what then I think typically happens is the keepers of the tradition forget how to read those stories over a period of time. And then you have to recover the keys to redeciphering them. I think that's kind of the state we're in right now but there's enough research out there that putting the pieces together, I think we can really begin to construct a coherent narrative and discover that the legacy from the past is far greater in extent than we imagined it. And if we just have the keys to unlock it, these meanings, we can begin to really see that what's come down to us is like the pieces of a puzzle. Like Jesse's in the other room building a puzzle. And, you get to a point where you get enough pieces in, you can say, that's a tractor.
Right.
He's building a puzzle and has a barn on it with a tractor. So, but, Yeah, so it's the same thing. If you well, you remember when you were kids, you had the connect the dots, right? You had the coloring books, and it was the
Yeah.
connect the dots. In
Mhm.
fact, you probably still have one, Russ. I
I do.
would imagine.
I love connect the dots.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you've got your Crayolas to go with it, and
Yep,
you're
yep.
all set. So, um, so anyway, so like when you played connect the dots when you were a kid, here's the important part I'm trying to get to. If you is that when you're connecting the dots, first you don't know what it is, right? You
Yeah.
got the dots, and each dot has a number by it, and you go connect 1, 2 to 3, 4, and then like you get to 7 or 8, and then you go, oh, okay, I see what that is. It's an elephant.
Yeah.
You know, there at some point where
Oh,
it
you figured
dawns
it out at
on you.
7? Wow.
Well, could be.
Some
Could
of
be
us have to
8.
get to like 20 or 30 before we see the elephant, Randall.
Oh. Well, yeah, that's why I graduated to the high achiever connect the dots, where you'd have 1,000 to 2,000 dots you had to connect, and usually it was at about 1,440. You'd realize what it is.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I see what that is. Yes, so
Yes, that's the encyclopedia.
um, yeah. Well, I was gonna let's see. So, going back to plasma for just a second, some of the natural. Well, yeah. So here's where nature has shown some manifestations of plasma forces in nature. And once you start pondering, you just begin to, I think, and learning about it, you begin to think it makes sense that this could be the potential basis of an alternate form of technology. So here's one form of plasma,
Oh, yeah.
right? And so another one. But check this out now. Check this coronal mass ejection coming up off the sun. Normally, it depends on the force with which this thing is ejected from the sun. You've got the loop here, the magnetic loop that reconnects it with the sun. So it's a closed loop. But if it's enough force welling up, what happens is this plasma plume opens up, just like the fucking Vajra. It opens up.
Ah.
And it throws this bolt of plasma off into space. To me, that's a very
Wow, I never
suggestive
thought of it,
correlation.
that they open up, yeah.
Yeah, they open up. And
They
some
al
of the
they
imagery.
also can I've read that they can twist, and then when if the legs coming up actually cross, then it causes like a sort of a short circuit, and that also it causes a massive flash, and that releases the
Yeah, yeah.
plasma in the arc, yeah.
And have you ever done any research into ball lightning?
Yes.
I think there's some important insight to be gained from ball lightning and the different manifestations of ball lightning, because they're plasma as well. And I think that, and this is beyond any coherent discussion I would want to get into tonight about the forms of it, but we could circle back and look, again, my learning about this is still quite preliminary, but I think I've seen enough to have a strong gut feeling that, yes, this is the direction we should be looking if we're going to try to recover a lost technology. That it was by means of using frequencies, that were governed by certain numbers, geometric forms that plasma could be induced to take under different frequencies, and that it would be possible to extract energy from some of these coherent forms. In fact, that's what seems to be the case with these toruses. They're produced by collapsing microbubbles, cavitation bubbles. And Malcolm was, he was not the innovator of that. There was a lot of them that did it before him that discovered that cavitation bubbles were the way to generate plasmas. I think what he came up with was a way of harvesting those plasmas based upon the idea of the Rank-Hilch vortex generator, where he was able to instead of ambient room air, he introduced ionized argon gas. And that ionized argon gas formed plasma vortices within the thunderstorm generator. And he was able to actually, using the geometry of the Rank-Hilch vortex, to bring two opposing streams with opposite polarity of plasma, coherent plasma, and bring them together. And I don't know what then happens, but apparently that's what's going on. Some variation of that. And that's yielding these very extraordinary events that I won't even try to get into because it's gone so far since this stuff. We first started talking about this back when we were still doing cosmographia. But yeah, I mean, they're doing a large-scale industrial testing of it in India right now, which is interesting. And I've seen the videos where they're interviewing, they're talking about it. They're doing industrial scale testing of the thunderstorm generator. And if you look up Rank-Hilch vortex tube and look at how that works, I mean, there's no moving parts to it. And I think if you study the components of it, you're going to go, that reminds me of something. What does it remind me of? Oh, the Vajra. The Vajra. Yeah, I think right there. I think they're showing us. And so, yeah, I would suggest if you guys are curious about this to look up that Rank, Ranque. And I think there's a lot of overlap with the work of Schauberger and his work with water vortices, because it looks more and more like he was able to generate plasma through water vortices. These others like Martin Fleischmann and Malcolm have been doing it through cavitation bubbles, microscopic, because they have to be really small because they have to be perfectly symmetrical. So by attaching it to a cylinder engine, what happens if you've got, you've got a compression stroke and you've got a vacuum stroke. So he was able to harness that to this thunderstorm generator so that the vacuum stroke actually pulls the argon gas up through the porous diffuser and produces these billions of microscopic bubbles. And then on the compression stroke, they collapse and it forms billions of little microtoruses, and they start putting off energy. That's basically what's going on. And it's got a lot of, unless it's a really extraordinarily fabricated hoax, or he's got, a dozen independent investigators now looking at this thing and getting the same results. It looks like there's something there. And I'm not qualified to have any final opinion on the matter, other than the fact that it sure does look like, from what I saw in one laboratory to what I know other people have seen and now reported on, and even making videos and putting online, who are building thunderstorm generators in their backyard and hooking them up to their pickup trucks. And then putting videos online there where they're showing, yeah, here, look at here, or a backyard generator. I mean, there's dozens of them out there now. So it looks to me like this thing is out of the realm of just purely conjectural. And what I've thought all along was the parallels between what's happening with the various aspects of plasma and the fact that these key numbers, that was to me what really clinched the deal that this is probably what we're looking at, is when it turned out that by applying these frequencies, and that's why the thunderstorm generator, it has concentric spheres and cylinders, and it only works if they're in a ratio of 4 to 3 to 2. And if you change those ratios, it loses this capacity to charge these vortices that are whirling inside the cylinders of the plasma. So that's a very interesting part of it to me, is that, just coincidentally and curiously, the 432 and the 864, those numbers are exactly the ratios at which, for example, you have an inner vortice of plasma, and then outside that, you've got another vortice of plasma whirling in the opposite direction. That's what's going on inside those cylinders. But the spacing of those vortices is critical. If you lose that 432, they begin to get turbulent, and you lose the coherence of the vortice. So when I learned that, I'm like, okay, so now you have these key ratios, and the numbers that express those key ratios are the fundamental numbers by which, the ancient Vedic traditions measured cosmological time. 432,000 years in a Kali Yuga, 864,000 years in the Dwapara Yuga, 4,320,000 years, in the Grand Yuga, the Maha Yuga. So there's cycles within cycles, spheres within spheres, cylinders within cylinders, and these key ratios are the key ratios that you were talking about earlier, because they define the dimensions and proportions of sacred architecture. And now we know enough now about sacred architecture to say, yeah, it's a very specific set of parameters that defines what sacred architecture is. It's not only just in the preparation of the materials and the choosing of the particular site, it's also just as critical as the orientation of the structure. It's not just set random in the landscape. And then, of course, the geometry of it. All of those things are intercombined, and it's the working together of these individual components, whether it's the geomantic or energy survey of the land, if it's geology, and it is very much connected to the underlying geology. It's not just placed randomly. They're placed very specifically on the surface of the earth in relation to the dominant type of minerals in the landscape, the movement of underground water, the movement of surface water, and all of that was considered to be integrated with the movements of the heavens. Wilhelm Reich showed that. He was able to show that he was able to provide a link, which he called orgone, which I would say is probably a plasma stream, when he was able to connect a stream of flowing water with the flowing atmosphere. And it created this movement that affected the atmosphere. He was able to read the stories. We could have me back and we could talk about Wilhelm Reich and his work with the orgone accumulator and the cloudbuster, because it completely supports this and the idea of what he called orgone. If we think that the orgone and the chi and the ki and all of the other various names that have been applied to the odic force, we could go on. The ruach in the Kabbalistic tradition, we could go on with the names. All of these shamanistic traditions had names for this energy, right? Clearly, it's just different ways of seeing the same thing. And now I think scientifically what we're able to show is that, yes, there's an actual palpable energy, and it's the fourth state of matter. And plasma is the link between the material world and the world that we would consider the spiritual world.
And I think we'll leave it there for this week. We actually recorded a lot with Randall. It was great to have him back on the show, but the conversation was wandering a bunch. So there are more topics. We'll publish that episode next week, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, guys. We love you. Always have, always will. Good night, Adamu. Get back to work.
I don't know, man. I just got to keep my nose to the grindstone. Keep plugging away, moving ahead, get as much done as I can while I can.
Yep. Before everything ends.
Before we get to the final termination of all time and space. I have certain goals that I have in mind.